She was 23 years old and homeless. Not temporarily between places, genuinely homeless, with a sleeping bag in the back of a truck that wasn't hers, and a canvas tote bag that held everything she owned that mattered. She had $9.60. She had been counting it for 2 weeks because she was afraid of the morning when she stopped having anything to count. That morning came on a Wednesday in November, and instead of spending what she had on food, she drove to the county assessor's office in Kellerton, Minnesota, and spent 9 of those dollars on an ice harvest shack on the frozen western edge of Lake Marin that the county had been trying to unload for 11 years. The clerk looked at the bill like it had come from a different century. 3 months later, when she took a hammer to the inside of the east wall because the insulation had rotted through, she found something that nobody, not the county, not the previous owners, not the entire town of Kellerton, had known was there. And nothing about her life was quiet after that. If stories like this one are the reason you're here, people who had nothing and built something real from it, I hope you'll subscribe before we get much further. It takes 1 second, and it means everything to this channel. And I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. I read every one. Lena Marsh grew up in the town of Fielding, 40 miles southeast of Kellerton, in a house that backed up against a creek that flooded every spring without fail, and that her father patched every summer with the same cheerful confidence that this time would be the last time. It never was. The creek flooded. He patched. The house smelled of must from May through July, and wood smoke from October through March, and in the narrow months between those two things, of the lilac bush outside the kitchen window that her mother had planted the year Lena was born. Her mother's name was Carol, and Carol was the kind of woman who filled every room she entered, not with noise, but with attention. She asked questions and actually waited for the answers. She remembered things, the name of your teacher, the outcome of the game, the thing you mentioned offhandedly 3 weeks ago that you had already forgotten mentioning. She kept a notepad on the kitchen counter for things she didn't want to forget, and Lena used to read it sometimes when Carol wasn't looking. Little entries in a handwriting so small and tidy it looked like it had been filed rather than written. Buy stamps. Elle's music recital, Tuesday the 9th. Call about the creek permit. She remembered everything. She wrote it down anyway. Carol died of a stroke when Lena was 14. She was at work when it happened, at the reception desk of a physical therapy clinic she had managed for 9 years, and she was there one moment and not the next. And nobody in the Marsh family ever quite knew what to do about the space that left behind. Raymond, Lena's father, did his best. He was not a complicated man, and grief was complicated, and so he was not very good at it. He went back to work 2 weeks after the funeral, kept the same routine, kept the house, cooked simple meals on the same nights he always had. He did not know how to talk about it, and Lena did not push him. And the result was a silence between them that was neither unkind nor sufficient. What Raymond had was an older brother named Don, and Don had opinions. Don lived in Fielding too, 20 minutes from the house on the creek, and after Carol died he came around more often, which sounded generous and was not entirely. Don had a way of managing situations by absorbing them, of inserting himself into decisions until the decisions were effectively his. He was not cruel. He was certain. There is a kind of person who mistakes certainty for authority, and Don was that kind. He decided what was best for Raymond and for Lena, and expressed these decisions in the tone of someone simply reporting facts. And Raymond, who was tired and grieving, and not a man who liked confrontation, rarely pushed back. When Lena was 17, Don decided she should go to work at his hardware store after school, instead of continuing with the regional youth orchestra she had been playing violin in for 4 years. The store needed the help, he said. The orchestra was a distraction, he said. The orchestra met 2 evenings a week and on Saturday mornings, and was the only place Lena went where she felt exactly like herself. which was something Dawn either didn't know or didn't factor in. She came home one Thursday afternoon to find the decision had already been made. Her violin case was on her bed, her work schedule was on the kitchen table, written in Dawn's handwriting, with her start date at the top circled twice. Her father was in the living room watching the evening news with the sound turned low and did not look up when she stood in the doorway reading it. She waited a moment. Then she folded the schedule along its crease and set it on the counter, and the next morning she went to rehearsal and told the conductor she was leaving. The conductor, a small woman with close-cropped gray hair who had encouraged Lena's playing for 4 years, looked at her for a long beat before she said she was very sorry to hear it. That was the last time Lena played with anyone else for many years. She worked the store for 2 years. She was good at it, organized, fast, better with customers than Dawn's own son, Marcus, who was her age and largely indifferent to both customers and the inventory, and who received better shifts regardless. She saved what she could. She played violin alone in her room 3 nights a week with the door closed, quietly enough that it never drew comment. She learned the hardware inventory the way you learn things when you are trying to make the best of a decision that wasn't yours, thoroughly, without resentment, because thoroughness was what she had. When she turned 19, she moved out, into a shared apartment in Kellerton, with 2 other young women she had met through a job at a diner on Route 7. She worked the diner and saved, and then the diner closed without much warning, and she picked up shifts at a gas station. And then the apartment lease ran out, and her roommates made other arrangements, and Lena's arrangements fell through, and by the time she was 23, she was sleeping in the bed of a truck that belonged to a woman from the gas station named Barb, who said she could borrow it for as long as she needed it, and who had meant 2 weeks and was now in the 5th month of not saying otherwise. Barb was 53, plain-spoken, and had grown up without much and said so without bitterness, the way some people discuss facts. She kept the truck's cab clean and left the spare key on a hook inside the station office without comment, and she did not ask questions about how things were going, which Lena understood was a form of respect she had earned and was grateful for. It was Barb who first mentioned the ice shack, not as a suggestion but as a thing she had noticed. She had seen the county listing the week before and thought it was curious. $9 for an old ice house on Lake Marin, she said one morning, refilling the office coffee maker. Can you imagine? Lena looked it up that afternoon on the station's computer. She thought about it for 3 weeks. She went back and looked again, and then on a Wednesday morning in November she counted what she had and drove to the assessor's office. She was not without options. Technically, she could have called Raymond. He would have taken her in, because he was her father and the Creek House was still the Creek House. But she would also have had to call Dawn, because Dawn managed Raymond's affairs whether Raymond asked him to or not, and she was not willing to do that. She was not willing to explain herself to a man who had taken her orchestra schedule off a wall and replaced it with his own without asking her. This was not stubbornness. It was a decision she had thought about carefully and could live with. So she counted $9.60 on a Wednesday morning in November, and she drove to the assessor's office, and she bought the Ice Harvest Shack on Lake Marin. The listing had been on the county's surplus property site for so long that the photographs were from a different decade, film photos, judging by the grain, scanned and uploaded by someone who had not bothered to level the camera. What they showed was a low wooden structure on the lake's western shore, roughly 20 feet by 30, with double-walled construction that had been standard for ice harvest buildings in this part of the state 100 years ago. It had been used commercially through the 1950s, then privately through the 1970s, then abandoned. The county had acquired it through tax default in 2001. It had been listed and relisted and reduced until the minimum was $9, which was the assessed cost of the paperwork. And nobody had claimed it because nobody could see a use for it, and because the access road from the county route was unpaved and became impassable in mud season, which in Minnesota was longer than people from other places expected. She drove out there the morning after she bought it, on frozen ground, mud season still 2 months away, in Barb's truck. The access road was rough but passable. The building itself was visible from about a quarter mile, sitting low and gray against the white of the lake. The kind of structure that looks like it has been beaten down by weather until it has simply decided to accept weather as its permanent condition. She parked and walked the last 100 yards and stood in front of it for a moment in the cold that bit at her ears through her inadequate hat. The door was unlocked. The hinges were rusted but functional. She pushed it open and stood in the entrance while her eyes adjusted. The inside was a single room, the floor bare wood over the lake ice that in the old days would have been cut through it for harvest. The double walls were thick, 8 inches of cavity between the inner and outer boards, packed with what had originally been sawdust insulation, the standard of its era. Most of it was still there. Some had settled and compacted, and some sections of the inner wall had separated from the frame and listed inward in long bowing panels that gave the room the look of a ship listing in slow motion. There was a rusted iron stove in the northwest corner, a section of pipe going through the roof, the pipe cap long gone so that the opening was stuffed with a wad of burlap someone had put there at some point as a stop against weather. There were hooks along the south wall, heavy iron ones, where equipment had once been hung, and there was a workbench along the east wall, hand-built from planks, scarred deep with tool marks and dark with old oil, solid as the day it was made. She walked the perimeter. She tested the floor, sound everywhere she stepped. She pressed on the inner wall panels, and where they bowed she found the outer wall behind them still straight and tight, the exterior boards original and intact. The roof had a patch above the stovepipe, newer boards against older ones, someone's repair from 30 years back. It had held. She stood in the middle of the room for a long time. The cold was thorough and even. Outside, the ice on the lake shifted somewhere with a deep, low sound, a long crack traveling under the surface, the way frozen things speak when they move. She pulled her coat tighter and thought about what $9.60 had purchased, and she thought it was either the worst decision she had ever made or the first real one, and she was not entirely certain those were different things. She drove back to Kellerton and went to the public library and spent 3 hours reading about ice harvest buildings, double-wall construction, and the history of commercial ice operations in the upper Midwest. The librarian, a thin man in his 60s named Arvid, who wore the same brown cardigan every time she came in, noticed what she was looking at and set a local history pamphlet beside her elbow without comment. She read it. The lake had been called Maren since the 1880s, named by a Norwegian settler for a woman in his family, and the ice harvest operation on its western shore had run from 1891 through 1958, employing as many as 30 men in season and supplying commercial ice to 4 counties. The building she had bought was the Harvest Shack, the structure where the ice was stored temporarily before transport, where equipment was kept and maintained, where the men had eaten their lunches and warmed their hands in the decades before the operation mechanized and then ceased. It had belonged to a family named Halvorsen. Arvid came by again as she was reading that and said, "You the one who bought the Halvorsen shack." It was not quite a question. "I am." He sat down across from her. He had the manner of a man who had been waiting for someone to be interested in this particular subject for a long time. Rolf Halvorsen ran it from 1931 to 1958, he said. His father before him from 1891. When commercial ice ended, he couldn't sell the property and eventually stopped paying taxes on it. He died in 1974. Arvid folded his hands on the table. There were people in this county who said Rolf Halvorsen was the most generous man they had ever known, and people who said he was the most private. Both were true. He paused. He used to keep things, specific things, in specific places. People who knew him knew that, but nobody knew what or where exactly. He was that kind of man. Lena looked at him steadily. What kind of things? The kind he wanted to outlast him, Arvid said. He stood up and straightened his cardigan. That's all I know. The rest is in the building. He went back to his desk, and that was the end of the conversation. She moved into the shack that week. This is not a comfortable sentence to write, but it is the accurate one. She parked Barb's truck inside. The double doors on the north end were wide enough for it, designed for horse-drawn sledges, and slept in the truck bed in her sleeping bag and used the iron stove for heat, learning its temperament over 3 days of cold and adjustment. She brought water in jugs from a gas station in Kellerton. She ate what she could afford. She worked during daylight hours on the inner wall panels that had come away from the frame, tapping them back into place with a borrowed hammer and the long spiral nails she found in a coffee can on the workbench shelf. It was during this work, on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after she moved in, that she noticed the east wall. The east wall was different from the others. Not visibly, the boards were the same age and the same color, the same surface. But when she tapped it with her knuckle in the way she had taken to testing the walls, looking for hollow spots where settling had created gaps in the sawdust, one section, a panel roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet tall, halfway along the wall, gave back a sound that was not sawdust. Not hollow, exactly. Denser, harder. She tapped it again. Then she pressed her palm flat against it. Even through the wall boards and her gloves, she could feel that it was colder than the surrounding surface. Not the cold of outside air, it was sealed against that. A colder cold. The cold of something that had been frozen and had stayed frozen for a very long time. She stood with her palm on the wall for a moment. Then she went to the workbench and found a pry bar and began, very carefully, to remove the inner board. If you're still with me, thank you for that. I know this story asks for your patience, and I don't take that lightly. If you've been thinking about subscribing, now's the moment, right before things change. Because they are about to change. Back to that east wall. The board came away cleanly. Behind it, in the 8-inch cavity, the sawdust insulation had been displaced, removed and packed around the edges to create a clear space, and in that space wrapped first in oilcloth and then in a second layer of something that turned out to be rubberized canvas of the kind used in old rain gear. Was a bundle roughly the size and shape of a large dictionary. It was frozen solid into the remaining sawdust at its edges, held by decades of Minnesota winter, but the wrapping had done its job and the contents, when she finally got them free and carried them to the stove and let them thaw slowly over 2 careful hours, were intact. Inside the oilcloth was a tin document box, the old-fashioned kind, black with a small hasp clasp, no lock. Inside the document box were 4 things. A small leather notebook, a bundle of letters tied with a length of cord, 22 of them by count, a folded paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map of the lake and its surrounding properties, detailed and precise, with notations in a cramped but legible hand, and beneath all of it, in a wax paper envelope that had kept its seal perfectly, a legal document, a deed and accompanying letter, notarized in 1971, conveying clear title to 43 acres of lakefront property adjacent to the shack to whoever presented themselves as the building's owner with the document in hand. 43 acres of Minnesota lakefront. She read the deed 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time. Then she sat down on the floor of the shack, on the boards above the frozen lake, and she looked at the iron stove and the rusted hooks and the oiled workbench, and she sat very quietly for a very long time. The notebook was Rolf Halverson's. She knew it from the first line, which read, in the same cramped hand as the map, Property Notes, R.H., begun January 1942. It was not a diary. It was a working record, maintenance notes, seasonal observations, equipment logs, but woven through the practical entries were other things. Short paragraphs, sometimes a single sentence, about the lake, about the work, about the men who had worked for him. One entry from February 1949 read, 3 feet of good ice today. Niemanen's youngest asked to stay on next season. Good worker, said yes. Another from 1953, storm took the north corner of the roof, fixed in 2 days, waste not. And then, in the entry dated December 3rd, 1971, the last entry in the book, a longer paragraph, written with a deliberateness the earlier entries lacked, as though it had been composed elsewhere and copied carefully here. I have put what should outlast me in the east wall. The land is the real thing. I had no children to leave it to, and I would not leave it to the county or to speculators who would cut it up. Whoever owns this building honestly has earned what is in that wall. I trust the building to find the right person. It found me once, it will again. She went to Arvid the next morning. She laid the document box on the reference desk and watched his face as he looked through it. He was a controlled man, measured in his expressions, but when he read the deed his stillness changed quality, became the stillness of someone absorbing something large. This is real, he said. He was not asking. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then, he never told anyone about this. No. He trusted the building. Arvid looked at the deed again. He trusted the person who would care enough to buy it for $9. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses. That's not a small thing to trust someone with. No, she said. It isn't. The legal process took 4 months. Patricia Strand, an attorney in Kellerton who had handled county property matters for 20 years and who charged Lena a reduced fee because she said the case was interesting, worked through the deed verification and the notarization records and the chain of title with a thoroughness that left nothing open. The deed was genuine. The property conveyance was valid. The 43 acres were hers. She did not sell them immediately, and she did not announce them, and she did not call Raymond or Dawn. She went on living in the shack while the legal work proceeded, stoking the iron stove and patching and improving the building by slow degrees, learning its particular language the way you learn any old structure. By listening to it, by pressing your hands against it, by paying attention to what it told you about itself in different weather. By February, she had the inner wall boards all resecured and 2 new sections of floor laid where the originals had softened. The new boards fitted precisely against the old. By March, she had replaced the stove pipe cap with a proper one and weather-stripped the double north doors and installed a used propane camp heater as a supplement for the coldest nights. Arvid came out to see it in March, driving a sensible sedan over the access road with the careful patience of a man accustomed to rural Minnesota. He walked the building the way she had come to walk it, touching walls, testing boards, listening. He kept it well, Arvid said, meaning Rolf. He was standing at the workbench, his hand on the scarred wood. He did, she said. He used to leave tools for people, Arvid said, without looking up. Men who came through looking for work in the season. He had a cabinet by the north doors. It's gone now, and he kept it unlocked with tools inside that anyone could borrow, on the understanding that they brought them back or passed them on to someone else who needed them. That's what people remember. Not the ice, not the land. That cabinet. He paused. He said a man who works with his hands and has the right tool for the job is not a poor man. She thought about that for a long time after Arvid left, about what it meant to leave something unlocked, about a cabinet that was gone but remembered, about a deed hidden in a frozen wall, waiting 40 years for the right person to find it. The following spring, she put up a tool cabinet by the north doors. She built it herself from leftover lumber and the hardware she could afford, which was not much but was enough. She stocked it with what she had, a good hammer, 2 sizes of pry bar, a handsaw, a set of screwdrivers, and she left it unlocked, on the understanding, which she told no one but which she felt was nonetheless communicated, that anyone who needed a tool could borrow it and return it when they were done. She did not announce what she had found in the wall. The legal filing was a matter of public record technically, but it was also not the sort of thing that gets noticed unless someone is looking for it, and in Kellerton in spring there was enough happening that nobody was looking. The word reached Raymond through a county filing that Don, who monitored such things, came across in May. Don called. He called Raymond first, and Raymond called Lena on a Saturday morning when she was fitting new shelving into the shack's southeast corner and had sawdust on her coat and no particular interest in the conversation she could already see coming. Raymond said, "Don says you have some property up on Lake Marin." "I do." A pause. Raymond's pauses had always been comfortable. He was not a man who rushed his own thinking. "He says it's a fair piece of land. 43 acres of lakefront." "Yes." Another pause. Then, in a voice that was quieter than the first, "Your mother would have liked that. She always said lakefront was the kind of thing worth holding on to." He was quiet for a moment. "You doing all right up there?" "I'm doing well," she said. And she meant it. Don called 3 days later. He called with the energy of a man who had been forming sentences for 72 hours and was now going to say them. He said that lakefront property of that size needed to be managed properly, that she should think about what she was doing, that there were people in the family who could advise her, that this was not the kind of thing a 23-year-old should be navigating alone. She listened to all of it. She let the sentences run their course. Then she said, "Thank you, Don," and she said she needed to get back to work. And she hung up. And she did. The decision about the land was not made quickly. She spent most of that year reading and thinking and talking to Arvid, who was the kind of advisor who helped you think without telling you what to think, which was rarer than it sounded and more valuable than most things. She talked to Patricia Strand, who said the options were wide open, and the only wrong choice was one made too fast. She walked every acre of the 43 in that first summer, and then again in the fall, learning its topography, its tree lines, its edge where the water met the reeds on the south side of the property, where a pair of sandhill cranes came every September. What she built there was not quick, and it was not simple, and it is still being built. But the shape of it had been clear to her since the day she read Rolf's last notebook entry, the one about trusting the building to find the right person. She thought about what trust like that required, the patience of it, the faith of it, the complete absence of any guarantee. She thought about a man who stocked a cabinet with tools and left it unlocked for strangers and said a man with the right tool for the job is not a poor man. She opened the land to a program for young people learning traditional woodworking and building trades. It was small at first, 6 students in the first summer, a partnership with a vocational program in Kellerton. Instruction from a craftsman named Eno, who was 71 and had learned his skills from his own father and had been wanting for years to pass them on to someone. They worked in the shack because the shack was the right space for it. And over time they improved the shack as part of the work. New flooring on the south half, a rebuilt window frame, the north door hardware replaced with hand-forged pieces that Eno taught them to make themselves. The document box sat on a shelf above the workbench, empty now, the papers with Patricia. The tin was there because it belonged there. The tool cabinet stayed unlocked. She heard from Don once more, the following spring, when a brief mention in a regional outdoors magazine noted the new program on Lake Marin and named her in the property. His message said she had done well. It said this with the tone of a man conferring a grade, as though his assessment was the thing that made the doing real. She read it once. She did not reply. She had a class arriving at 9 in the morning, and a section of wall framing she wanted to demonstrate before the ground softened, and that was where her attention was. By the 3rd year, the program had 14 students in a summer session, a waiting list, and a second instructor who had been one of the first students and had proven to be the best teacher Eno had ever seen, which was a thing Eno said plainly and without embarrassment the way skilled people sometimes acknowledge skill in others when they are not threatened by it. On the workbench, in a shallow tray she had made herself from a piece of the old flooring she'd replaced in the first winter, she kept the things that mattered. Rolf's notebook, the wax paper that had held the deed, flattened and preserved behind a piece of glass because it seemed important to keep. A photograph that Arvid had found in the Historical Society archives. Rolf Halvorsen standing in front of the shack in what Arvid believed was 1948. A man of perhaps 50 in a heavy coat and work boots. One hand resting on the north door, looking at the camera with an expression that was not quite a smile and not quite serious, something in between, something patient and knowing, the look of a man who is already thinking about what comes after. She was 23 years old and homeless. She had $9.60 and a sleeping bag and a borrowed truck and no address. She spent 9 of those dollars on a building that nobody in the county had managed to want for 11 years. And what she found frozen in the east wall was not just a deed to 43 acres. It was proof that someone, a man she would never meet, in a winter that ended before she was born, had done the same kind of arithmetic she was doing on that Wednesday morning in November, had looked at what he had and what came after, and had decided that the only thing worth doing with it was to save it for the right person and trust the building to know who that would be. What Rolf Halvorsen understood, and what Lena came to understand, is that the most lasting things we leave behind are not the ones we announce. They are the ones we hide with care. In the cold, in the walls of the places we love, for the people who will find them by being exactly the kind of person who would find them. The world is full of things left in walls. Most of them are never found. The ones that are, find the people who were meant to have them. She was 23 and homeless. She had $9.60. And what she found frozen in the east wall of an ice harvest shack on a Minnesota lake was something that had been waiting for her for 40 years, in a wall that never let it go. Thank you for being here for this one. If it moved you, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need it. And if you haven't subscribed, this is the moment. These stories deserve to travel. Here is my question for this week, and I mean it sincerely. Has there ever been a time in your life when you found something, a letter, an old photograph, a note tucked away somewhere, that made you feel like a stranger had been thinking about you before you arrived? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and these are my favorite ones to read. See you in the next one.